Valentine Yves Mudimbe, The Invention of Africa. Introduction. This book evolved accidentally as a result of an invitation to prepare a survey of African philosophy. Strictly speaking, the notion of African philosophy refers to contributions of Africans practicing philosophy within the defined framework of the discipline and its historical tradition. It is only metaphorically, or at best from a historicist perspective, that one would extend the notion of philosophy to African traditional systems of thought, considering them as dynamic processes in which concrete experiences are integrated into an order of concepts and discourses. I have thus preferred to speak of African Gnosis. Gnosis? Gnosis. Gnosis. J. Fabian used the notion of gnosis in his analysis of a charismatic movement. In this book, the wider frame seems better suited to the range of problems addressed, all of which are based on a preliminary question. To what extent can one speak of an African knowledge, and in what sense? Etymologically, gnosis is related to gnosko, which is the ancient Greek word which means to know. Okay, so the correct pronunciation is gnosis. Is related to gnosko, which is the ancient Greek word for to know. Specifically, gnosis means seeking to know, inquiry, methods of knowing, investigation, and even acquaintance with someone. Often the word is used in a more specialized sense, that of higher and esoteric knowledge, and thus it refers to a structured, common, and conventional knowledge, but one strictly under the control of specific procedures for its use as well as its transmission. Gnosis is, consequently, different from doxa, or opinion, on the other hand, cannot be confused with episteme, understood as both science and general intellectual configuration. The title is thus a methodological tool. It embraces the question of what is and what is not African philosophy, and also orients the debate in another direction by focusing on conditions of possibility of philosophy as part of the larger body of knowledge on Africa called Africanism. I use the central notion of conditions of possibility in accordance with a recent tradition in which Michael Foucault could, for example, define his own intellectual ambition in terms of its dependence on alteration that Jean Hippolyte introduced into Hegelian philosophy. What the notion of conditions of possibility indicates is that discourses have not only socio-historical origins but also epistemological contexts. It is the latter which make them possible and which also account for them in an essential way. I shall be dealing with discourses on African societies, cultures, and peoples as signs of something else. I would like to integrate their modalities, significance, or strategies as a means of understanding the type of knowledge which is being proposed. In fact, I do not address the classical issues of African anthropology or history, the results of which might or might not mirror an objective African reality. Rather, I am looking upstream of the results, precisely at what makes them possible, before accepting them as commentary on revelation or restitution of an African experience. The book attempts, therefore, a sort of archeology of African gnosis as a system of knowledge in which major philosophical questions recently have arisen. First, concerning the form, the content, and the style of Africanizing knowledge. Second, concerning the stasis of traditional systems of thought and their possible relation to the normative genre of knowledge. From the first chapters, which integrate Western images of Africa, through the chapters analyzing the power of anthropologists, missionaries, and ideologists, to the last on philosophy, I am directly concerned with the process of transformation of types of knowledge. This orientation has two consequences. On the one hand, an apparent attenuation of the originality of African contributions, and on the other, an overemphasis upon external procedures, such as anthropological or religious influences. The fact of the matter is that, until now, Western interpreters, as well as African analysts, have been using categories and conceptual systems which depend on a Western epistemological order. Even the most explicitly Afrocentric descriptions, models of analysis, explicitly or implicitly, knowingly or unknowingly, refer to the same order. Does this mean that African Weltschauungen and African traditional systems of thought are unthinkable and cannot be made explicit within the framework of their own rationality? My own claim is that thus far, the ways in which they have been evaluated and the means used to explain them relate to the theories and methods whose constraints, rules, and systems of operation suppose a non-African epistemological locus. From this viewpoint, the claim of some African philosophers such as O. Bimweni and E. Ebosi Bolaga that they represent an epistemological hiatus should be taken seriously. What does this mean for the field of African studies? To what extent can their perspectives modify the fact of a silent dependence on a Western episteme? Would it then be possible to renew the notion of tradition from, let us say, a radical dispersion of African cultures? These are the most important issues in the debate on African philosophy. They oblige me to clarify immediately my position about representatives of African Gnosis. Who is speaking about it? Who has the right and the credentials to produce it, describe it, comment upon it, or at least present opinions about it? No one takes offense if an anthropologist is questioned, but strangely enough, Africanists, and among them anthropologists, have decided to separate the real African from the westernized African and to rely strictly upon the first. Rejecting this myth of the man in the bush, J. John chose to turn to those Africans who have their own opinion and who will determine the future of Africa, those, in other words, of whom it is said that they are trying to revive the African tradition. Yet Jean's decision seems exaggerated. I would prefer a wider authority, intellectuals' discourses as a critical library, and, if I could, the experience of rejected forms of wisdom which are not part of the structures of political power and scientific knowledge. In sum, rather than simply accept the authority of qualified representatives of African cultures, I would like to study the theme of the foundations of discourse about Africa. It is obvious that in such a subjective work, I cannot claim to offer an exhaustive report analyzing all present tendencies or encompassing all within its frame. This book is only a critical synthesis of the complex questions about knowledge and power in and on Africa. The presuppositions and hypotheses outlined above indicate a range of theoretical alternatives that I have been working on for the last 15 years. If, from l'autre face du royaume to l'ordre du pré, and this contribution, my general view has somewhat changed. I believe that my major thesis has remained the same with respect to the analogical form of the social sciences and the history of Africanist discourse. These disciplines do not provide a real comprehension of the Weltanschauungen studied. Yet one can also say that it is in these very discourses that African worlds have been established as realities of knowledge, and today Africans themselves read, challenge, rewrite these discourses as a way of explicating and defining their culture, history, and being. It is obvious that since its inception, Africanism has been producing its own motifs as well as its objects and fundamentally commenting upon its own being, while systematically promoting a gnosis. From this gnosis ultimately arose both African discourses and otherness and ideologies of alterity, of which negritude, black personality, and African philosophy might be considered to be the best established in the present-day intellectual history of Africa. Some of my critiques, for example, Mpoi Boatu, 1983, Nzembele, 1983, and Wilame, 1976, have aggressively urged me to draw political implications from my conclusions. Others, such as Morales, have instead thought my project, that of dealing with taboo themes, overly ambitious. I only hope that some people would agree that the task of bringing philosophy to some of its own limits and metaphors in social science, and that of questioning philosophy's ambiguous contacts with unphilosophical discourses, justify my commitment not to philosophy, nor to an invented Africa, but to what it essentially means to be an African and a philosopher today. I am grateful to El Kumba, whose phenomenological study of the significance of identity in my literary work forced me to re-evaluate the implications of my theses about the same and the other in philosophical anthropology. Yet, his critique meets my fundamental beliefs. Identity and alterity are always given to others, assumed by an I or a we subject, structured in multiple individual histories, and, at any rate, expressed or silenced according to personal desires vis-a-vis an episteme. This also implies that from a methodological viewpoint, I think, as Foucault put it, that discourse in general and scientific discourse in particular is so complex a reality that we not only can, but should approach it at different levels and with different methods. For this essay, I have chosen an archeological perspective that allows me to address the issue of the progressive constitution of an African order of knowledge. However, for reasons having to do with the bizarre nature of some of the sources used, mainly the anthropological ones, I have preferred not to distinguish the epistemological level of knowledge from the archaeological level of knowledge. I am deeply indebted to the Joint Committee of African Studies on the Social Science Research Council in conjunction with the American Council of Learned Societies. They invited me to write the study and gave me the necessary facilities. A briefer and slightly different form of chapters 3 and 5 was published by the African Studies Review in 1985. The biography at the end reveals my intellectual debt to many works and scholars. In this bibliography, I present books I have indeed used. I did not think it important to include such authors as Aristotle, Descartes, Diderot, Rousseau, or Voltaire, to whom I sometimes refer. In the same manner, it did not seem useful to include a number of narratives and texts by explorers, colonial theorists, and popes. They generally express a normative doxa and its submission to an episteme. As such, they reveal the development of anthropological and philosophical theories. As to non-English books I quote, I have often, but not always, consulted the originals, even when the existing translations were excellent. It's apart from stated exceptions. I generally make reference to English versions when available. If an English version or English edition is not mentioned in the bibliography, the translation is my own. I must express explicitly my gratitude to some friends and colleagues without whom this book would perhaps not have been written, or certainly not yet finished. Elizabeth Boyi for her encouragement, Christine Agwao for her editorial assistance, Kofi Agawu, Paul Reisman, and Ivan Karp for their critical evaluations. I'm particularly grateful to Arnd Baum, Walter Michener, David Newberry, and Mildred Mortimer, whose patient reading of the entire manuscript and critical comments helped me clarify many points and translate my Gaelic style into the English language. I extend my gratitude to Haverford College and in particular to Robert Stevens, Robert Gavin Jr., Wyatt McGaffey, and Judy Young for their support and generosity. Finally, I have to express my special thanks to Shirley Averill for her useful suggestions, the typing of many drafts of the manuscript, and her unfailing patience. Roberta L. Deal and Janet Rabinowicz, my editors, deserve grateful acknowledgement for their advice, support, and efficiency. Needless to say, the ideas, hypotheses, and interpretations put forth in this book are completely my responsibility. The Invention of Africa. Chapter 1. Discourse of Power and Knowledge of Otherness. Colonizing Structure and Marginality. Lord, have pity on us, the human race? Phyllis exclaimed, stressing the second word in her astonishment. That's what it says here, Jin assured her. Don't start off by interrupting me. POL, Planet of the Apes. The scramble for Africa and the most active period of colonization lasted less than a century. These events, which involved the greater part of the African continent, occurred between the late 19th and the mid-20th centuries. Although in African history, the colonial experience represents but a brief moment from the perspective of today, this moment is still charged and controversial, since, to say the least, it signified a new historical form and the possibility of radically new types of discourses on African traditions and cultures. One might think that this new historical form has meant, from its origins, the negation of two contradictory myths, namely, the Hobbesian picture of a pre-European Africa, in which there was no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continued fear and danger of violent death, and the Rousseauian picture of Africa, of an African golden age of perfect liberty, equality, and fraternity. Although generalizations are of course dangerous, colonialism and colonization basically mean organization and arrangement. These two words derive from the Latin word colere, meaning to cultivate or to design. Indeed, the historical colonial experience does not and obviously cannot reflect the peaceful connotations of these words. But it can be admitted that the colonizers, those settling a region, as well as the colonialists, those exploiting a territory by dominating a local majority, have all tended to organize and transform non-European areas into fundamentally European constructs. I would suggest that in looking at this process, it is possible to use three main keys to account for the modulations and methods representative of colonial organization, the procedures of acquiring, distributing, and exploiting lands in colonies, the policies of domesticating natives, and the manner of managing ancient organizations and implementing new modes of production. Thus, three complementary hypotheses and actions emerge: the domination of physical space, the reformation of natives' minds, and the integration of local economic histories into the Western perspective. These complementary projects constitute what might be called the colonizing structure, which completely embraces the physical, human, and spiritual aspects of the colonizing experience. This structure clearly also indicates the projected metamorphosis envisioned at great intellectual cost by ideological and theoretical texts, which from the last quarter of the 19th century to the 1950s have proposed programs for regenerating the African space and its inhabitants. MSZ thinks that the great historical tragedy of Africa has been not so much that it was too late in making contact with the rest of the world, as the manner in which that contact was brought about. Europe began to propagate at the time when when Europe began to propagate at a time when it had fallen into the hands of the most unscrupulous financiers and captains of industry. He refers to the second part of the 19th century, emphasizing the coexistence of imperialist ideology, economic and political processes for extending control over African space, and capitalist institutions which ultimately led to dependence and underdevelopment. In a recent book, D.K. Fieldhouse derives that only a dogmatist would attempt to state categorically that colonialism was either totally inconsistent with economic development in the dependencies, or alternatively, that it was the best possible medium for stimulating their growth. Colonialism was not sufficiently consistent over time to justify any such sweeping assertions, nor were its objectives sufficiently coherent to achieve any particular result. Thus, colonialism has been some kind of historical accident, a largely unplanned and, as it turned out, transient phase in the evolving relationship between more and less developed parts of the world. This accident, on the whole, according to this view, was not the worst thing that could have happened to the Black continent. Essentially, the argument is not new. It has a history that goes back to the debate of the early decades of the century. In his book, Imperialism, a Study, J.A. Hobson linked the scramble for Africa to capitalism and capitalist search for higher profits from colonial conquests. For J.A. Schumpeter, in 1918, colonialism, as well as its cause, imperialism, did not obey logic. It was non-rational and irrational, purely instinctual inclinations toward war and conquest that guided objectless tendencies towards forcible expansion without definite utilitarian limits. Against the Leninist theme of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, 1917, he stated that a purely capitalist world offers no fertile soil to imperialist impulses. Capitalism is by nature anti-imperialist. And in a voluminous document full of statistics, the balance sheets of imperialism, 1936, Grover Clark demonstrated that colonialism was not only economically irrational, but also ruinous for the colonial powers. On the opposite side, at the risk of being labeled dogmatists, Marxist interpreters accept the essentials of Lenin's thesis. The contention of neo-Marxists such as Samir Amin, Paul Barron, Andre Gunder Frank, and Emanuel Wallerstein is that if colonialism was inconsistent with economic development, it was at least, since its inception, quite consistent with its own economic interests and objectives. Accordingly, colonialism should have produced a body of knowledge on the means of exploiting dependencies. It should have also produced a kind of empirical technique for implementing structural distortions by positing four main political propositions. First, priority given to the Industrial Revolution over the Agricultural Revolution. Second, the simultaneous production of all branches of industry with a preferential approach to heavy industry. Third, emphasis on tertiary and service activities. Fourth, preference for exports and the preference for exports to the detriment of the total economic system. The outcome of these policies was the process of underdevelopment initiated everywhere colonialism occurred. This process can be summed up in 3 points. First, the capitalist world system is such that parts of the system always develop at the expense of the other parts, either by trade or by transfer of surplus. Second, the The underdevelopment of dependencies is not only an absence of development, but also an organized structure created under colonialism by bringing non-Western territory into the capitalist world. Third, despite their economic potential, dependencies lack the structural capacity for autonomy and sustained growth, since their economic fate is largely determined by developed countries. From this last contention, some theorists have quickly hypothesized that if Japan has escaped the predicament of underdevelopment, it is because it is the only non-Western country to have escaped colonialism. It seems impossible to make any statement about colonialism without being a dogmatist, particularly where economic organization and growth are concerned. Different as they are in form and intention, the Marxists and peripheral theorists have nevertheless the same focus: overseas territory, totally reorganized and submitted to a Western model. The first theory considers colonial imperialism as a calculated and inevitable accumulation of capitalism. If the latter discounts the planned aspect of colonialism, it still assumes the phenomenon to be a consequence of European industrialization and development, somehow bound to expand overseas. Whatever theory one accepts, the application remains the same, leading inevitability to what I have called the colonizing structure responsible for producing marginal societies, cultures, and human beings. Therefore, for the purpose of clarity further on, let me make clear the dichotomy that this structure creates, and which is a sign of what I. Sachs calls Europe-centrism. It is a model which dominates our thought, and given its projection on the world scale by the expansion of capitalist and the colonial phenomenon, it marks contemporary culture imposing itself as a strongly conditioning model for some and forced deculturation for others. Because of the colonizing structure, a dichotomizing system has emerged, and with it, a great number of current paradigmatic oppositions have developed: traditional versus modern, oral versus written and printed, agrarian and customary communities versus urban and industrialized civilization, subsistence economies versus highly productive economies. In Africa, a great deal of attention is greatly given to the evolution implied and promised by the passage from the former paradigms to the latter. This presupposed jump from one extremity, underdevelopment, to the other, development, is in fact misleading. By emphasizing the formulation of techniques of economic change, the model tends to neglect a structural mode inherited from colonialism. Between the two extremes, there is an intermediate, a diffused space in which social and economic events define the extent of marginality. At the economic level, for example, if the relatively low productivity of traditional processes of production, formally adapted to the then existing markets and range of trade and exchanges, has been disrupted by a new division of labor which depends upon international markets, then transformation has meant a progressive destruction of traditional realms of agriculture and crafts. As a second example, one could regard the social disintegration of African societies and the growing urban proletariat as results of a destabilization of customary organizations by an incoherent establishment of new social arrangements and institutions. Finally, if at the cultural and religious levels, through schools, churches, press, and audiovisual media, the colonizing enterprise diffused new attitudes which were contradictory and richly complex models in terms of culture, spiritual values, and their transmission. It also broke the culturally unified and religiously integrated schema of most African traditions. From the moment on the forms and formulations of the colonial culture and its aims were somehow the means of trivializing the whole traditional mode of life and its spiritual framework. The potential and necessary transformations meant that the mere presence of this new culture was a reason for the rejection and unadapted persons and confused minds. Marginality designates the intermediate space between the so-called African tradition and the projected modernity of colonialism. It is apparently an urbanized space in which, as S. Amin noted, vestiges of the past, especially the survival of structures that are still living realities, tribal ties, for example, often continue to hide the new structures, ties based on class or on groups defined by their position in the capitalist system. This space reveals not so much that new imperatives could achieve a jump into modernity as the fact that despair gives this intermediate space its precarious pertinence and simultaneously its dangerous importance. As P. Biko put it recently, the young nations rightly fear seeing their original world swallowed up in the whirlpools of industrial society and disappear forever. Somewhat like animal species, we try with difficulty and often in vain to protect against the invasion of technical man. There is no doubt that direct or indirect colonialism always provokes, in the countries that experience it, cultural constraint, a contamination the more profound as it is hidden. Lifestyles and modes of thinking of the dominant nations tend to impose themselves on the dominated nations. Moreover, they are accepted, even sought after. Models spring up, alienating factors for the people who adopt them. At any rate, this intermediary space could be viewed as the major signifier of underdevelopment. It reveals the strong tension between a modernity that often is an illusion of development and a tradition that sometimes reflects a poor image of a mythical past. It also unveils the empirical evidence of this tension by showing concrete examples of developmental failures such as demographic imbalance, extraordinarily high birth rates, progressive disintegration of the classic family structure, illiteracy, severe social and economic disparities, as dictatorial regimes functioning under the cathartic name. Wait. Balance, classical family structure, illiteracy, severe disparities, dictatorial regimes functioning under the cathartic name of democracy, the breakdown of religious traditions, the constitution of synthetic churches, etc. Sorry, my bad. In general, troubled by such confusion, social scientists prefer to plead for a reassessment of programs of modernization. No doubt many theorists are still to be proposed and plans to be made. Yet one may already understand that this marginal space has been a great problem since the beginning of the colonizing experience. Rather than being a step into the imagined evolutionary process, it has been the locus of paradoxes that called into question the modalities and implications of modernizing in Africa. Discursive formations and otherness. It is certain that the learned Antel, or Antilli, without being a misanthrope, was not interested at all in human beings. He would often declare that he did not expect much from them anymore. From Planet of the Apes. The colonizing structure, even in its most extreme manifestations, such as the crisis of South Africa, might not be the only explanation for Africa's present-day marginality. Perhaps this marginality could, more essentially, be understood from the perspective of wider hypotheses about the classification of beings and societies. It would be too easy to state that this condition, at least theoretically, has been a consequence of anthropological discourses. Since Turgeon, who in the late 1750s first classified languages and cultures according to whether the peoples are hunters, shepherds, or husbandmen, and ultimately defined an ascending path from savagery to commercial societies, non-Western marginality has been a sign both of a possible absolute beginning of a primitive foundation of conventional history. Rather than retracing an already too well-known evolutionary hallucination, let us take a different angle by examining both the issues derived from a 15th century painting and the allocation of an African object to 19th century anthropology. Commenting upon Las Meninas, whatever, of Velázquez, Michael Foucault writes, "The painter is standing a little back from his canvas. He is glancing at his model. Perhaps he is considering whether to add some finishing touch, though it is also possible that the first stroke has not yet been made. The painter is at one side of the canvas working or meditating on how to depict his models. Once the painting is finished, it becomes both a given and a reflection of what made it possible." And Foucault thinks that the order of Las Meninas seems to be an example of a representation which undertakes to represent itself in all its elements, with its images, the eyes to which it is offered, the faces it makes visible, the gestures that call it into being. Yet in the amazing complexity of this painting there is remarkable absence. The person it resembles, and the person in whose eyes it is only a resemblance. Now let us consider Hans Bergkammer's painting Exotic Tribe. It is the painter sitting back contemplating his exotic models? How many? It is not even certain that a model is present in the room where Bergkammer is thinking about ways of subsuming particular versions of human beings. The year is 1508. Meter is still alive. Bergkammer is by then a respected master of the new school of Augsburg he has founded. He would like to please the Fougères and the Welsers and has agreed to illustrate Bartholomew Springer's book on his travels overseas. He has carefully read Springer's diary, has probably studied some clumsy pencil or pen and ink sketches, and has decided to draw 6 pictures of, quote, primitives. The first picture of the series seems to represent a family. Let us imagine the painter at work. He has just read Springer's description of his voyage, and possibly on the basis of some sketches, he is trying to create an image of blacks in Guinea. Perhaps he has decided to use a model, presumably white but strongly built. The painter is staring at the pale body, imagining schemes to transform it into a black identity. The model has become a mirror through which the painter evaluates how the norms of similitude and his own creativity would impart both a human identity and a racial difference onto his canvas. Perhaps the artist is already at work. He has to stop regularly, walk around the model, leave the luminous space before the window, and retire into a discreet corner. His gaze addresses a point, which is a question: how to superimpose the African characteristics described in Springer's narrative onto the norms of the Italian contrapposto. If he succeeds, the painting should be, in its originality, a celebration and a reminder of the natural link connecting human beings, and, at the same time, an indication of racial or cultural differences. It should bear witness to the truth of similitudes, analogies, and possibly even the violence of antipathy. At any rate, Kunst notes that the nude African depicted from behind conforms to the classical rule of contrapposto, expressed in the compensatory balance of symmetrical parts of the body in movement, one shoulder leaning on one leg and the other raised above the free leg. One guesses that this nude man was copied from a classic model to which the artist gave characteristics, jewelry, and swords of an exotic people still strongly attached to nature. It is easy to dismiss my concern about similitude in this particular creative process. I am not projecting a 20th century perspective onto the pictorial techniques of the early... He says, am I not projecting a 20th century perspective onto the pictorial techniques of the early 16th century? The structure of figures is there in the first small painting, treated in a typical way. The fuss about similitude might just be, after all, only a contemporary hypothesis about the process of establishing links between beings and things from our present viewpoint. Yet it is possible to look for issues stemming from Bergkamar's representation. I have no idea if I'm spelling that right, and I actually don't really mind if I'm butchering the name. These people. In effect, we can describe his artistic filiation and his dependence upon the classic ideals of the Renaissance. We can also compare the principles of his technique with those apparent in some contemporary works, directly or indirectly dealing with black figures, such as Erasmus Grasse's Moor Dances, Hieronymus Bush's Garden of Delights, Kathleen the Moor Woman, and Albrecht Dürer. At the very end of the century, Cornelius van Haarlem's Batseba, speculating about or analyzing the contrasts between white and black figures in these paintings, one could certainly search for a vision which refers to historically conventional explanations. For example, the sense of the characters and the idea of design, that is to say, of expression by means of the pure disposition of contours and masses, and by the perfection and ordering of linear rhythm. The complex play of colors in harmony and opposition, the order of shades between the white and the black are, obviously, based on such intellectual and conscious references. But does not our understanding of the colorful economies of canvases refer, in a very insistent manner, to invisible traces? The contrasts between black and white tell a story which probably duplicates a silent but powerful epistemological configuration. Ex hypothesi, it might simply be a similitude interplay. Convenitia, armalatio, analogy and sympathy tell us how the world must fold upon itself, duplicate itself, reflect itself, or form a chain with itself so that things can resemble one another. They tell us what the paths of similitude are and the directions they take, but not where it is, how one sees it, or by what mark it may be recognized. Let us return to Bergkamer's finished painting. The three black figures, a boy, a man, a seated woman with a baby pressed to her breast, have the right proportions to one another and the wider context. All are naked and have either bracelets around their arms or 4-string around their necks, clear signs that they belong to a, quote, savage universe. The little boy is dancing, his oversized head turned toward the sky. At the center of the canvas, the man, presented in clear, strong lines, is staring at a faraway horizon, brandishing an arrow with his left hand and holding 2 other arrows in his right hand. He incarnates power, not only because he occupies the central place in the painting, but also because he is the most well-defined signifier in this scene. He is the locus defining the relationship between the boy at his left and the woman at his right, depicted with both a touch of hieratic sense and a slightly instinctual force. At the right, the woman with the baby is seated on a trunk. She seems to be staring pensively at the pelvic area of the man. The curves of her body are canonically executed. The whole picture, in its simplicity and in the balanced rhythms of its lines, seems a truly charming and decorative painting. Yet, what it really expresses is a discursive order. The structure of the figures, as well as the meaning of the nude bodies, proclaim the virtues of resemblances in order to designate Springer's blacks. The painter has represented blackened whites. This was not rare during the 16th and 17th century, as a great number of the drawings of the period reveal. That is the case, for example, of the fifth picture in Filippo Pigafetta's 1591 edition of his Relazione del Riama di Congo, representing 3 Italianized African women, and that of the African king in the frontispiece of J. Ogilby's book on Africa, 1670. What is important in Bergkamer's painting, as well as in similar drawings, is their double representation. The first, whose objective is to assimilate exotic bodies into 16th century Italian painting methodology, reduces and neutralizes all differences into the sameness signified by the white norm, which, let us keep in mind, is more religious history than a simple cultural tradition. In concrete language, this reference meant a biblical solution to the problem of cultural differences, which was regarded by most men as the best that reason and faith could propose. That is, the same origin for all human beings, followed by geographical diffusion and racial and cultural diversification. And it was believed that the Bible stipulated that the African could only be the slave of his brethren. There is another level, a more discreet one. It establishes a second representation that unites through similitude and eventually articulates distinctions and separations, thus classifying types of identities. Briefly, I can say that in Bergkamer's painting, there are 2 representational activities. On the one hand, signs of an epistemological order, which silently but imperatively indicate the processes of integrating and differentiating figures within the normative sameness, and on the other hand, the excellence of an exotic picture that creates a cultural distance thanks to an accumulation of accidental differences, namely blackness, nakedness, curly hair, bracelets, and strings of pearls. In their arrangements, these differences are pertinent signs. Because of the fundamental order which they reveal and to which they bear witness, the virtues of resemblance erase physical and cultural variations, while maintaining and positing surface differences as meaningful of human complexity. Diego Velázquez's Juan de Pareja, 1648, still articulates this integrating reference, whereas major paintings such as Peter Paul Rubens' Study of Four Blacks' Heads, 16-something, Rembrandt's Two Negroes, 1697, and Hyenchi's Young Black, 1697, explicitly express and relate to another order. A new epistemological foundation was then functioning in the West. Theories of diversification and of beings, as well as classificatory tables, explain the origins of constructing taxonomies and their objectives. The framework of Linnaeus's, I did know Linnaeus, my goodness. The framework of Linnaeus's Systema Naturae, 1735, is just one of the paradigmatic classifications of species and varieties of Homo sapiens, Europaeus, Asiaticus, Americus, and Afar, distinguished according to physical and temperamental characteristics. It would be too easy to link it upstream to discursive formations about the great chain of beings and its hierarchy, and downstream first to Blumenbach's craniology, and second to the general anti-African bias of the philosophical and scientific literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. Two very different discursive formations, the discovery of African art and the constitution of the object of African studies, that is, the invention of Africanism as a scientific discipline, can illustrate the differentiating efficiency of such general classifying devices as pattern of reality, designation, arrangement, structure, and character. I have already suggested that resemblance has been pushed out of Rubens's, Rembrandt's, and Richard's perceptions of blacks. What is there, given in detailed description, might be considered as a naming and an analysis of an alterity, and refers to a new epistemological ordering, a theory of understanding and looking at science in terms of the arrangement of identities and differences into ordered tables. Portuguese sailors brought to Europe the first feticos, African objects supposedly having mysterious powers in the late 15th century. Okay. One finds them mostly in well-organized curio cabinets, along with Indian tomahawks or arrows, Egyptian artifacts, and Siamese drums. Some interpreters do consider them to be signs of a state of barbarism, yet one can firmly state that more frequently they are seen as simple curiosities brought back in accordance with the 10th ask of the Traveller Observer in the table of Berenius's Geographica Generalis, to consider famous men, artificers, and inventions of the natives of all countries. On the whole, these objects are culturally neutral, because their shapes and styles, sometimes a bit terrifying, they account for the mysterious diversity of the same. It is not until the 18th century that, as strange and ugly artifacts, they really enter into the frame of African art. The Black Continent was still on the maps, a terra incognita, but its peoples and their material products were more familiar to travelers, students of the human species, merchants, and European states. From the beginning of the 18th century, there had been a tremendous increase in the slave trade and a profitable transatlantic economy, which involved most of the Western countries. In West Africa, Dahomey was a powerful commercial partner of European traders. The Ashanti Empire expanded, dominating the Akans and the Oyo Kingdom further to the east and increasing its power as it grew. Freed slaves and impoverished Africans were settled by European-sponsored organizations in present-day Sierra Leone, on the east coast in, 17? Great. Don't know what that date is. 17-something. Africans expelled the Portuguese from their forests in the northern region of Mozambique. And down south, in 1770, there was the first war between Dutch immigrants and Bantus. 2 years later, James Bruce, traveling north to Central Africa, reached the source of the White Nile in the very year that Chief Justice Mansfield declared in England that slavery was against the law. In this atmosphere of intense and violent exchanges, fetichos became symbols of African art. They were viewed as primitive, simple, childish, and nonsensical. Mary H. Kingsley, at the beginning of the century, summed it up with an axiomatic evaluation. The African has never made an even 14th rate piece of cloth or pottery. It seems to me that a process of aestheticization took place from the 18th century onward. What is called savage or primitive art covers a wide range of objects introduced by the contact between African and European during the intensified slave trade into the classifying frame of the 18th century. These objects, which perhaps are not art at all in their native context, became art by being given simultaneously an aesthetic character and a potentiality for producing and reproducing other artistic forms. Taken in their initial function and significance, might they have created a radical mise en perspective of the Western culture wedded to classifications? That is precisely an impossibility. Arts are based on criteria, and it is difficult to imagine that these standards can emerge from outside the, quote, power knowledge field of a given culture, a field which, at a historical period, establishes its artistic Bible. Therefore, it is obvious that fetishes and other primitive pieces of art are wonderful because their structure, character, and arrangement demand a designation. They are, quote, savage in terms of the evolutionary chain of being and culture which establishes a correspondence between advancement in the civilizing process and artistic creativity as well as intellectual achievements. At this point, paradoxically, it is a celebration of the African craftsmanship which confirms my analysis. Admiring the beauty of a, quote, Negro sculpture, the late R. Fry was puzzled. It is curious that a people who produced such great artists did not produce also a culture in our sense of the word. This shows that two factors are necessary to produce the cultures which distinguish civilized peoples. There must be, of course, the creative artist, but there must also be the power of conscious, critical appreciation and comparison. Fry is, I'm afraid, utterly wrong. These two factors do not and cannot explicate types of cultures. They only constitute a basis for the production of art and its possible modifications over time. They cannot completely account for the internal patterns of cultures. At any rate, it is the, quote, power knowledge of an epistemological field which makes possible a domineering or humbled culture. From this perspective, the point that Fry makes immediately after has great sense. It is likely enough that the Negro artist, although capable of profound imaginative understanding of form, would accept our cheapest illusionist art with humble enthusiasm. That's a quote from Fry. 1940-91. My thesis is confirmed almost ad absurdum by Jules Rosset's study of contemporary African tourist art. She defines this art as an art produced locally for consumption by outsiders and strongly insists on the paradoxical interaction between its origin and its destination, that is, its production and its consumption. Although the concept of the tourist art system emphasizes how artists and their audiences perceive images and convert them into economic commodities, it does not neglect the expressive components of the interaction. Within the system, both images and actual objects constitute sources of exchange between producers and consumers. Although artists have a definite impression of the tourist audience, consumers often have little direct contact with the artists. Jules Rosset, 1984. This concept of tourist art implies, in principle, a critique of the classical understanding of art. It also explicitly means a relativization of what the author calls assumptions about the manner and quality of tourist art productions, namely its mass production character, the relative inexperience of present-day craftspeople, the collectivization in the artistic production, and the dominance of consumer demand over artistic creativity. A limpid argument upholds the thesis of the study. Tourist art is both a symbolic and an economic exchange. This can be understood, according to Jules Rosset, by reference to three models. First, the traditional African arts that have ceremonial and social significance may and do become objects produced primarily for external trade. Second, there are, in the very being of tourist art, signs of a major tension existing between folk culture and haute culture. Or, as Jules Rosset puts it, folk culture is implicitly contrasted with something else, haute culture. There is an inherent tension and asymmetry between the ideals of high culture and the profit motives and new reproductive technologies that sustain the growth of the market of popular cultures. As the horizons of this artistic production, Jules Rosset insists on the fact of Western reading of African creativity and its propositions for innovations in African workshops. The international tourist market demands The international tourist art market depends upon the Western demand for exotic, souvenir, and gift items and the assumption that they should be procured abroad. The artists and craftspeople utilize this demand as a stimulus for creating new ideas and technologies to meet the needs of the expanding market. African tourist art and its contradictions. Is it an art? In which sense and according to what kind of aesthetic grid? Are just an ad valem consequence of the process, which, during the slave trade period, classified African artifacts according to the grid of Western thought and imagination, in which alterity is a negative category of the same. It is significant that a great number of European representations of Africans, or more generally of the continent, demonstrated this ordering of otherness. For example, Andreas Sculter's painting Africa, 1700, is structured upon a complex relation between a nude black woman and a frightening lion standing protectively behind her voluptuous body. The African allegory, 1765, of Caesar Ripa in Knowledge is a biblical and scientific text. The content's name is linked etymologically to Afer, Abraham's son, yet in contrast to the continent's peculiarity is presented with powerful symbols: the black color of a horned woman, a monstrous animal with a human face, surrounded by serpents and bizarre birds. The African has become not only the other who is everyone else except me, but rather the key which, in its abnormal differences, specifies the identity of the same. G.B. Tipolos, Africa, 1750 to 1753, Delacroix's Algerian Woman, 1834, and a multitude of other paintings can be read for their implications. Traces of something else whisper, slips of color reveal the meanings, and treads of a secret stair indicate the magnitude of a new order. These representations are contemporary with the Enlightenment discussions on such axiomatic proportions as men are born unequal, and such questions as the place of the savage in the chain of being. In the following years, the sagas of exploration began with J. Bruce's expedition into Ethiopia in 1770 and Mungo Park's journey into the river Niger in 1795. The novel text which emerges from these expeditions is not fundamentally original. It reveals characteristics already well circumscribed and established. the distinction between savage Negro and civil Mahometan, and the commentaries on the Africans' indolence, their unbridled passions, and their cruelty or mental retardation were already there. They formed a part of the series of oppositions and of the levels of classification of humans demanded by the logic of the chain of being and the stages of progress and social development. Explorers just brought new proofs which could explicate African inferiority. Since Africans could produce nothing of value, the technique of Yoruba statuary must have come from Egyptians. Benin art must be a Portuguese creation. The architectural achievement of Zimbabwe was due to Arab technicians, and Hausa and Buganda statecraft were inventions of white invaders. This tendency appears in other fields as well. Two French botanists, A. Chevalier in 1938 and R. Porterez in the 1950s, suggested that the African continent could have been a very early locus of plant domestication. On the basis of linguistic data, see anthropologist G.P. Murdoch expounded in a similar proposition. On the basis of linguistic data, the anthropologist G.P. Murdoch expounded a similar proposition and postulated a pseudonymic complex of crops. Corpse didn't sound right. These hypotheses were dismissed, and today by far the most popular view of the origins of cereal crop agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is that it was the product of human migration or some form of culture diffusion or stimulus deriving from Southwest Asia. Here is a last illustration. The work of M. Griaule and his disciples in Dogon country have demonstrated the complexity of Dogon astronomical knowledge and its symbolism. Carl Sagan, professor of astronomy at Cornell University, assumed the task of checking the validity of Dogon cosmology. Sagan begins by noting his surprise. In contrast to almost all pre-scientific societies, the Dogon hold that the planets are, as well as the Earth, rotate but about their axes and revolve around the sun. Strangely enough, rather than using Griaule and his disciples as documentation, Sagan exploits a certain temple who summarized Griaule's discoveries. The Dogon go further. They hold that Jupiter has 4 satellites and that Saturn is encircled by a ring. Unlike every astronomer before Kepler, the Dogon are said to depict the planets moving correctly in elliptical, not circular orbits. Most amazing for Sagan seems to be the following. The Dogons contended that Sirius has a dark and invisible companion star which orbits Sirius once every 50 years. They state that the companion star is very small and very heavy, made of a special metal called sagala, which is not found on Earth. The remarkable fact is that the visible star does have an extraordinary dark companion, Sirius B, which orbits it in an elliptical orbit once each 50.04 to 0.09 years. Sirius B is the first example of a white dwarf star discovered by modern astrophysics. Its matter is in a state called relativistically degenerate, which does not exist on Earth, and since the electrons are not bound to the nuclei in such degenerate matter, it can properly be described as metallic. How can we explain the Dogon's astronomical knowledge? Sagan has a hypothesis. I picture a Gallic visitor to the Dogon people. He may have been a diplomat, an explorer, an adventurer, or an early anthropologist. This man has read, or perhaps still has, a copy of Sir Arthur Stanley's Eddington's book, The Nature of the Physical World, published in 1928, in which the density of white dwarf stars is discussed. The conversation turns to astronomical lore. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. The Dogon regale the visitor with their Sirius mythology. Then, smiling politely, expectantly, they inquire of their visitor what his Sirius myth might be. The white dwarf companion of Sirius being a current astronomical sensation, the traveller exchanges a spectacular myth for a routine one. After he leaves, his account is remembered, retold, and eventually incorporated into the corpus of Dogon mythology. When Marcel Griaule makes mythological inquiries in the 1930s and 40s, he has his own European Sirius myth played back to him. All this is sheer speculation. Had Sagan carefully consulted knowledgeable sources, he would not have confused facts and symbolic levels in order to make his point about a beautiful, full cycle return of a myth. Let us note 3 facts. First, the orbiting cycle of Sirius B is analogized and reflected in the celebration of the Sigui, a ritual introduced by a mythological ancestor of the Dogons, Diongu Seru. It is celebrated every 60 years, a symbolic period that integrates the 50 years of the revolution of Sirius B, for the Dogons, the star of the Fonio, plus 10 years, which makes the ritual agree with the Old Man and system of numeration by 60, and with its esoteric symbols. The last Sigui ritual took place in 1967 and was filmed by J. Rausch and G. Dieterlen and released under the title La Caverne de Bongo. The preceding Sigui performance was in 1907 and before that in 1847. The rite is celebrated under the sign of the star of the Fonio. Indeed, this companion of Sirius is the representation in the sky of the little Fonio seed. Second, if one wants to validate Sagan's hypothesis, one should in fact demonstrate that a European traveller hurried to the Dogon region just after the 1844 discovery by E.W. Bessel of the sinusoidal motion of Sirius. He must have thought it well for the Dogons promptly to integrate it into their myths to the point that it could perfectly function in a set of major founding symbols in time for the 1847 ritual of Sigui. Third, the preceding superstition seems difficult, since the existence of Sirius B was, in Western science, really discovered in 1862 by A.G. Clarke. Dogons had already used the symbolism of the Fonio in their R84 and 1787 rituals of Sigui. Specialists in oral civilizations can easily check this. At the same time, they should evaluate the historical credibility and context of Diongo Seru, who according to Dogon tradition is both the one responsible for the loss of immorality and the inventor of the Sigui cycle. On the other hand, I see another problem. The Dogon's concept of Sagala, a metal which does not exist on Earth and which constitutes the nature of Sirius's companion, is strongly linked to the Sigui mythical cycle. It thus seems to go relatively far back in the history of the ritual, whereas in Western science, the hypothesis of the relativistically degenerate nature of Sirius B was made for the first time in the 1930s. Most scientists did not then accept the concept, which, by the way, was proposed by an Indian scholar, S. Chandra Sekhar. To conclude this long illustration of an epistemological ethnocentrism, I suppose by now it has become clear how controversial Carl Sagan's hypothesis is. Let us sum up. First, I do not believe that the Dogons got their astronomical knowledge from extraterrestrials. The bad faith, in the Sartrean sense, with which Sagan destroys the thesis and fantasies of E. von Däniken, who claims this is in Chariots of the Gods and Gods from Outer Space, makes me suspect that Sagan and von Däniken are probably closer than they suspect. Second, Sagan's way of treating the Dogons well illustrates the power of a will to truth. Metaphor might generalize this case. Let us imagine a theorist who is enclosed in Euclidean geometry. He thinks about, believes in, and writes on the impossibility of non-Euclidean systems. These, in effect, would incarnate the possibility of incredible contradictions, such as the intellectual reality of an intrinsic truth, e.g. a validity demonstrated theorem in Euclidean geometry, which would be simultaneously an extrinsic error, that is, a validity negated proposition in the logic of a non-Euclidean geometry. As we know, there are such things as non-Euclidean geometries. Thus, my metaphor could at least become a symbol. It might not make sense at all to reduce non-Euclidean systems to Euclids, since the systems spring from radically different postulates and sets of axioms. In brief, although presented in the second part of the 20th century, Carl Sagan's hypothesis belongs to 9th century reasoning about primitives. In the name of both scientific power and knowledge, it reveals a marvelous way what I shall define in the following chapter as an epistemological ethnocentrism, namely the belief that scientifically there is nothing to be learned from, quote, them, unless it is already ours or comes from us. I'm going to repeat that because I think that's important. It reveals in a marvelous way what I shall define in the following chapter as an epistemological ethnocentrism, namely the belief that scientifically there is nothing to be learned from them unless it is already ours or comes from us. Explorers do not reveal otherness. They comment upon anthropology. That is, the distance separating savagery from civilization on the diachronic line of progress. R. Thornton claims that the discovery of Africa was also a discovery for paper. Had the great Victorian travelers not written anything, it would not be said today that they had discovered anything. Strictly speaking, however, it seems difficult to prove in a convincing way that Livingstone, Stanley, Burton, Grant, Speck, and others entered into the enterprise for the sake of the text. Other students can invoke other motives, such as the classical ones of curiosity, courage, generosity, contempt, etc. At any rate, the explorer's text is not epistemologically inventive. It follows a path prescribed by a tradition. Expedition reports only establish a very concrete, vivid representation of what paintings and theories of social progress had been postulating since the Baroque period. In what the explorer's text does reveal, it brings nothing new besides visible and recent reasons to validate a discipline already remarkably defined by the Enlightenment. The novelty resides in the fact that the discourse on savages is, for the first time, a discourse in which an explicit political power presumes the authority of a scientific knowledge and vice versa. Colonialism becomes its project and can be thought of as a duplication and a fulfillment of the power of Western discourses on human varieties. The development of anthropology, which up to the very end of the 18th century was sought within travelers' narratives, now takes a radical turn. From now on, it will develop into a clearly visible power-knowledge political system. As Foucault put it, ethnology has its roots, in fact, in a possibility that properly belongs to the history of the European culture, even more to its fundamental relation with the whole of history. There is a certain position of the Western ratio that was constituted in its history and provides a foundation for the relation it can have with all other societies. Obviously, this does not mean that the colonizing situation is indispensable to ethnology. Neither hypothesis nor the patient's alienation within the phantasmatic character of the doctor is constitutive of psychoanalysis, but just as the latter can be deployed only in the calm violence of a particular relationship and the transference it produces, so ethnology can assume its proper dimensions only within the historical sovereignty always restrained, but always present of Ethiopian thought and the relation that can bring it face to face with all other cultures as well as with itself. African Genesis. I would like to use Frobenius' expression African Genesis, 1937, to formulate hypotheses about the epistemological locus of Africa's invention and its meaning for discourses on Africa. The genesis of anthropological science took place within the frame of mercantilist ideology. We all know that during the 18th century, as G. Williams puts it, colonies were of value only insofar as they brought material benefits to the mother country. On the other hand, it is during this same century that, paradoxically, original interpretations of savages were proposed by Enlightenment social scientists. And I quite agree with R.L. Meek that if we look at their work, what shine out of its virtues rather than its vices, its brilliant institutions rather than its occasional logical lapses, its adventurousness and novelty rather than its dogmatism. To defend this point, Meeks quotes Marvin Harris, The Rise of Anthropological Theory, 1968, Benjamin Keane, The Aztec Image in the Western Thought, 1971, and Sidney Pollard, The Idea of Progress, 1958. I may add Claude Lévi-Strauss, Anthropologie structurale, 2, 1973, and M. Duchet, Anthropologie et Histoire au Ceci des Lumières, 1977. The problem is that during this period, both imperialism and anthropology took shape, allowing the reification of the primitive. The key is the idea of history with the capital H, which first incorporates St. Augustine's notion of providentia and later on expresses itself in the evidence of social Darwinism. Evolution, conquest, and difference become signs of a theological, biological, and anthropological destiny and assign to things and beings both their natural slots and social mission. Theorists of capitalism, such as Benjamin Kidd and Friedrich von Bernhard in Germany, as well as philosophers. Benjamin Kidd and Karl Pearson in England, Paul Leroy Beaulieu in France, Frederick Newman and Friedrich von Bernhard in Germany, as well as philosophers, comment upon two main and complementary paradigms. These are the inherent superiority of the white race, and, as already made explicit in Hegel's philosophy of right, the necessity for European economies and structures to expand to virgin areas of the world. From this point, various schools of anthropology developed models and techniques to describe the primitive in accordance with changing trends within the framework of Western experience. These different trends can easily be explained from two angles. The first is an ideological one and concerns the relationship between an individual's projection of consciousness, the norms exemplified by one's society, and this social or scientific dominant group. On the other hand, mainly since the end of the 18th century, natural sciences have served as models for the progressive and wavering implementation of social sciences. In concerto, one thinks of those ideological interests of strata that are in various ways privileged within a polity and, indeed, privileged by its very existence. On the other hand, Aristotle's invitation to study in beings the plane of nature, animal, is mathematized. New methodological grids link social facts and physical phenomena, laws of structural organization and distribution, patterns in individual or collective development, account for historical transformations. The social scientist tends to imitate the naturalist and compresses social behaviors and human cultures into scientific paradigms. These actually remain subsumed by what is defined as the goal of knowledge. Paul Vane recently made some strong statements about the confusion which comes out of this legacy. Buffon thought that the fly should not hold a greater place in the concerns of the naturalist than it occupies in nature. On the other hand, he maintained a value relationship with the horse and the swan. But zoology has changed a great deal since then, after Lamarck had pleaded the cause of the lower animals. Every organism became of interest in the science. Weber was indignant that the history of the Bantus could be studied as much as that of the Greeks. Let us not retort that times have changed, that the Third World and its nascent patriotism, that the awakening of the African people who are taking an interest in their past, it would be a fine time to see that patriotic consideration should be the criterion of intellectual interest, and that Africans have more reasons to despise Greek antiquity than Europeans had to despise Bantu antiquity. At the level of organization of discourses, these two factors, the impact of ideology and the model of natural sciences, can serve as guides to the relative epistemological unity of social sciences since the 19th century. For instance, it would be easy to draw a parallel between philosophy and anthropology. We wrongly tend today to consider the former, and particularly its offshoot, linguistics, as more scientific than the latter. Morgan's historicism of systems of consanguinity and affinity of the human family, 1871, matches the positivism of Max Muller's lectures on the science of language, 1861 and 1864, in which fidelity to August Schleicher's Stammbaumtabuche is integrated with Darwin's general postulations. In the same way, the Wettenbuhre, which is central in J. Smith's work, is similar to the diffusionist perspective of Ankerman, Forbuynus, and Graebener in anthropology. The principles of association and difference invoked by Bose and Loewe resemble many hypotheses in the philosophical field. Examples are the Junggrammatika, interpretations of analogy in the evolution of language exemplified by Meyer Lübke's work, or the perspectives opened by H. Schuchart's Über die Leuxe, in which the major concept, the Sprachmischung, implies the necessity of subordinating general laws, such as those promoted by Darwin's disciplines, to the complexity and alterity of the objects described and studied. I do not mean that there is an unquestionable genealogical dependence or obvious synchronic connection between these theories. It is clear, for example, that deals with extensively with multidimensional comparison, while Bose avoids it. In simpler words, I mean that anthropology and philology and all social sciences can be really understood only in the context of their epistemological region of possibility. The histories of these sciences, as well as their trends, their truths, as well as their experiences, being derived from a given space, speak from it and primarily about it. Given that one also might agree that from the anthropology of Buffon, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot to the most modern studies, such as J. Favret Sadar's study of witchcraft in France, 1977, the basic concern of anthropology is not so much the description of primitive achievements and societies as the question of its own motives and the history of the epistemological field that makes it possible and in which it has flourished as retrospectivist or perspectivist philosophical discourse. Thus, ethnocentrism is both virtue and its weakness. So it's both its virtue and its weakness. It is not, as some scholars thought, an unfortunate mishap, nor a stupid accident, but one of those major signs of the possibility of anthropology. Some thinkers, such as Levi Strauss, thought that studying a diversity of cultures reduced the weight of ideology and allowed anthropologists to fight such falsehoods as those about the natural superiority of some races and traditions over others. From this ethical point of view, some scholars have wondered whether it was possible to think of an anthropological science without ethnocentrism. It is surely possible, as functionalism and structuralism proved, to have works that seem to respect indigenous traditions. And one could hope for even more profound changes in anthropology, as R. Wagner proposes. But so far it seems impossible to imagine any anthropology without a Western epistemological link. For on the one hand, it cannot be completely cut off from the field of its epistemological genesis and from its roots. And on the other hand, as a science, it depends upon a precise frame without which there is no science at all, nor any anthropology. I distinguish two kinds of ethnocentrism: an epistemological filiation and an ideological connection. In fact, they are often complementary and inseparable. The first is a link to an episteme, that is, an intellectual atmosphere which gives to anthropology its status as discourse, its significance as a discipline, and its credibility as a science in the field of human experience. The second is an intellectual and behavioral attitude which varies among individuals. Basically, this attitude is both a consequence and an expression of a complex connection between the scholar's projection of consciousness, the scientific models of the time, and the cultural and social norms of his society. For example, for the 18th century, one might think of the differences existing between Goujet or Gouget, Goujuet, Quensnay, and Helvetius, independently of the content of their interpretations of the stages of evolution. See Duchet, 1971, Meek, 1976. Frobenius and Levi Bruhl offer in the same manner, and their ethnocentrism is quite different from that of, say, Michel Leries or Margaret Mead or Carl Sagan. I could say that the epistemological filiation maintains and sustains anthropology as a system of knowledge and as a developing science. Cultural ethnocentrism explains ideological changes and struggles in the history and practice of the social science discipline. The fact that universal civilization has for a long time originated from the European center has maintained the illusion that European culture was, in fact, and by right, a universal culture. Its superiority over other civilizations seemed to provide the experimental verification of this postulate, Moreover, the encounter with other cultural traditions was itself the fruit of that advance, and more generally, the fruit of Occidental science itself. Did not Europe invent history, geography, ethnography, sociology, etc., in their explicit scientific forms? In the colonizing experience, the mingling of these two aspects of ethnocentrism tended, most naturally, to be complete in both the discourse of power and that of knowledge, to the point of transforming the mission of the discipline into an enterprise of articulation. And the anthropologist decided to take charge of controlling evolutionary processes. Anthropology, which used to be the study of beings and things, retarded, gradual, and backwards, is now faced with the difficult task of recording how the savage becomes an active participant in modern civilization. Still, it is clear that since the beginning of the 19th century, explorers' reports had been useful for opening the African continent to European interests. Myth about beastly savages, barbaric splendors, or the white man's grave go along quite well with the tropical treasure house theory. The promises of the Golden Land or New Orphea, and with the humanitarian principles of suppressing the slave trade and for Christianizing and civilizing the Africans. Theories of colonial expansion and discourses on African primitiveness emphasize a historicity and the promotion of a particular model of history. In other words, Mungo's Park's Journal of a Mission, 1815, or Richard and John Lander's report, 1838, essentially addresses the same issues that R.E. Burton, V.L. Cameron, H.M. Stanley, and E.D. Lugard spelled out in different words, and on which 20th century anthropology focuses. This is the discrepancy between civilization and Christianity on the one hand, primitiveness and paganism on the other, and the means of evolution or conversion from the first stage to the second. From this point of view, it can be said that, for instance, J. Chaliot-Bert's programmatic theory of the steps of colonization, agriculture, commerce, industry, has the same significance as Lugard's views on the European mandate in Africa. What they propose is an ideological explanation for forcing Africans into a new historical dimension. Finally, both types of discourses are fundamentally reductionist. They speak about neither Africa nor Africans, but rather justify the process of inventing and conquering a continent and naming its primitiveness or disorder, as well as the subsequent means of its exploitation and methods for its regeneration. In fact, the question might be a bit more complicated and also dramatic for the imperial power of same if we take into account, for example, Ricoeur's meditation on the eruption of the other in the European consciousness. When we discover that we are several cultures instead of just one, and consequently at the same time, when we acknowledge the end of a sort of cultural monopoly, but it illusory or real, we are threatened with the destruction by our own discovery. Suddenly it becomes possible that there are just others, that we ourselves are an other among all others. All meaning and every goal having disappeared, it becomes possible to wander through civilizations as if through vestiges and ruins. The whole of mankind becomes a kind of imagery museum. Where shall we go this weekend? Visit the Angkor ruins or take a stroll in the Tivoli of Copenhagen. In addition, Paul Ricoeur's anguished propositions, one should note the still song anthropological spirit exemplified by N. Barley's small book, Adventures in a Mud Hut, 1984. In 1978, Barley decided to turn his attention to the Dowayos, a strangely neglected group of mountain pagans in North Cameroon. They were interesting for him. They had, for example, skull cults, circumcision, a whistle language, mummies, and a reputation for being recalcitrant and savage. The result is a brief memoir, which 10 years ago would have qualified as arrogant, or at best disrespectful of both fieldwork and the peoples described. Between commentaries on their heavily Africanized version of Marianne, the French revolutionary heroine, and the fact that it is ridiculous that it should be in Africa that people of different races should be able to meet on easy, uncomplicated terms, one gets intrusive lessons. Among them, the following to sum up the project's scientific interest about the whole business of anthropology, the author states. Frankly, it seemed then, and seems now, that the justification for fieldwork, as for all academic endeavor, lies not in one's contribution to the collectivity, but rather in some selfish development. Like monastic life, academic research is really all about the perfection of one's own soul. This may well serve wider purpose, but is not to be judged on those grounds alone. As to the doyens, his adventures in a mud hut gave Barley reasons for believing that, in attempting to understand the doyo view of the world, I had tested the relevance of certain very good general models of interpretation and cultural symbolism. On the whole, they had stood up pretty well, and I felt much happier about their place in the scheme of things. This, wrote a reviewer in the Daily Telegraph, is probably the funniest book that has been produced this year. The evaluation has since served for publicizing the essay. In a more neutral manner, I would say that this book is epistemologically significant. It convincingly illustrates my two previously described dimensions of ethnocentrism in the social sciences, the pertinence of an individual's projection of consciousness and the perception of a discipline from the normative perspective of its practice and history. It comments upon itself from within a paradigmatic cultural model. Barley assumes a magnificent position which allegorically indicates the space of his introspectiveness and his African anthropology. Face to face with Africa, the differences between a French botanist and an English anthropologist seem minimal, and we talked far into the night. Thus, we are not only dealing with a potential imaginary museum, but with concrete constraints produced by two major orders: a topographical dimension which explains how and why discourses on the same and the other are expounded, and a cultural order which in the disorder of what today seems to be a common humanity indicates clear divisions, subtle frontiers, and sometimes the so-called openings to oneness. I suppose that it is now clear that the trouble with Barley's text is not its ideological orientation. In fact, there seems to be none, at least no explicit one, apart from its superb interrogation of anthropology as a business of old stories. What it reveals at the end is an absolute and almost immoral hypercriticism and a metaphorization of cultural reading. So, for instance, this English alien back in Europe rediscovers La Ville Éternelle and notes, "I paced the streets of Rome like a Dawayo sorcerer whose unearthly slowness sets off his ritual role from everyday activities. Saved from Italian robbers and sent to England by the British Embassy in Rome, one of the most important things he remembers is being alien. An hour after my arrival, I was phoned by one friend who merely remarked tersely, 'Look, I don't know where you've been, but you've left a pullover at my place nearly 2 years ago.' When are you going to come and collect it? In vain, one feels such questions are beneath the concern of a returning prophet. In effect, a topographical configuration accounts for Bali's discourse, and a cultural atmosphere might explain his addiction to cream cakes and to anthropology. As to his impressionist message, it is a strikingly modernized lesson on Conrad's questions in Heart of Darkness. Why is African culture a barbarous experience? What is European civilization, and in which sense is it different? For a history of African studies and discourses, it is therefore important to notice that apparent changes within the dominant symbols have never fundamentally modified the meaning of African conversation, but only the policies for its ideological and ethnocentric expression and practice. Present-day intellectual categories can allow, as demonstrated by Copons in this periodization, a distinction between travel and literature, ethnology and applied anthropology. Yet, it is so erroneous to depend on this type of theoretical distinction, which is concerned with differences of ideological policies, in order to distinguish genres of African knowledge. Travelers in the 18th century, as well as those in the 19th century and their successors in the 20th, colonial proconsuls, anthropologists, and colonizers, spoke using the same type of signs and symbols and acted upon them. During the colonial era, those consistently involved reduction of differences in a Western historicity. During the colonial era, these consistently involved reduction of differences into a Western historicity. This does not imply that Western inventions of an African genesis did not distinguish levels and types of interpretations of Africa. The author of Ursprung der afrikanischen Kulturen, for example, could in an article on the origin of African civilizations perceive that the demands of his discipline were not met by the traveler's information. Far from bringing us answers to our questions, the travelers have increased our enigmas by many an addition. Today, the best students, faced with contradictory reports, will ask pertinent questions. What are these reports witnessing to? Do they contribute to a better knowledge of the African past? Are they scientifically credible and acceptable? C. Vanicina, 1962, if correctly answered, these propositions led, in principle, to a new understanding of human history. As Vane put it, if the Bantu Homo historicus proved to be a more primitive organism than the Athenian, it would only add to the interest, for it would thus reveal a less known part of the plan of nature. As for knowing, Weber asks the question, how many pages are to be devoted to Bantu history and how many to Greek? The answer is simple. It all depends on the volume of documentation. The question I am dealing with is one which would account for the possibility of anthropological knowledge and its meaning for the foundation of both Africanist discourses and African Gnosis. I am proposing to formulate it through a critical synthesis of Foucault's thesis on the last archaeological rupture in Western epistemology, a brief interpretation of Levi Strauss's notion of savage mind, and finally, a plea for the importance of the subject in social sciences, a subject that structuralism too easily pretends to have killed. These philosophical questions of method should, I hope, affirm the usefulness of both an epistemological analysis and a critical understanding of Africanism.